Welcome to Ancient Edge. When you envision the Roman Empire, your mind likely conjures images of towering stone aqueducts slicing across valleys, marble temples gleaming under Mediterranean sun, and the Colosseum standing as an eternal monument to engineering. But here's what history often forgets. Rome was not merely an empire of stone. It was fundamentally an empire of wood. Beneath every stone bridge lay timber foundations. Behind every conquered city stood massive wooden siege towers. Across every river stretched wooden bridges that carried legions to the edges of the known world. And here's the paradox that should shake our modern understanding. These wooden structures didn't just survive for decades, they endured for centuries, some remaining functional long after the empire itself crumbled. Today, we build with treated lumber that warps within years, yet the Romans constructed timber frameworks that laughed at time itself. How? The answer lies not in petrification or fossilization, but in a sophisticated material science we've nearly forgotten. The Roman timber arsenal, beyond the oak. You know, the Romans didn't simply grab the nearest tree and start building. Their relationship with timber was deeply strategic, almost spiritual in its precision. While oak became their legendary choice for critical infrastructure, particularly the mighty Quercus species native to the Italian peninsula, their timber selection revealed an understanding of wood that, honestly, modern forestry is only beginning to replicate. They knew that oak cut from trees grown on rocky, mineral-rich slopes developed denser grain patterns than valley-grown specimens, and they understood that the northern face of a tree, growing more slowly in reduced sunlight, produced wood with tighter rings and really superior strength. But the real magic happened after the cutting. Roman timber seasoning wasn't the rapid kiln drying we employ today. Instead, they practiced what ancient sources describe as patient preparation, a process that could span years. Logs were often buried in damp earth or submerged in rivers, allowing water to slowly leach out sugars and starches that would otherwise attract wood-boring insects and fuel fungal decay. Vitruvius, the first-century architect whose De Architectura remains our primary window into Roman building science, documented specific seasoning periods for different wood types. Fir needed submersion in flowing water. Oak required burial in moist clay. This wasn't folklore. It was, in fact, deliberate manipulation of wood's cellular structure. The slow water-logging compressed cell walls and expelled air pockets, creating timber that was dimensionally stable and resistant to the very biological processes that destroy modern wood. The Romans also read wood like a language. They understood that the heart of the tree, the darker, denser heartwood, contained natural preservatives that the outer sapwood just didn't have. They knew that splitting wood along its grain, rather than, sawing across it, preserved the integrity of those long cellulose fibers that give timber its tensile strength. Every cut, every selection, was really an act of applied botany. Ancient alchemy, preservatives and treatments. Here's where Roman ingenuity, really transcends into something resembling ancient chemistry. They didn't have the synthetic preservatives we inject into pressure-treated lumber today, yet their wood outlasted ours by centuries. The secret lay in harnessing nature's own arsenal. Archaeological evidence from Roman bridge foundations reveals timber impregnated with natural resins extracted from pine and fir trees. These resins, rich in terpenes and phenolic compounds, acted as natural biocides, creating an environment hostile to the bacteria and fungi that decompose wood. But the Romans went further. They developed lime-based plasters that weren't mere coatings, but active, protective systems. By mixing slaked lime with pozzolana, that miraculous volcanic ash from the hills around Naples, and adding extracts from tree bark, possibly containing tannins, they created a plaster that didn't just sit on wood's surface, but bonded with it chemically. Recent analysis of Roman timber recovered from the Ponte Fabricio, Rome's oldest surviving bridge built in 62 BCE, shows evidence of this lime treatment penetrating millimeters into the wood grain. This plaster possessed a remarkable property. When microcracks formed, rainwater would react with unhydrated lime particles, producing new calcium carbonate crystals that literally healed the fractures. You know, the Romans had actually invented self-healing protective coatings nearly 2,000 years before we even thought we'd discovered them. But honestly, the most ingenious preservation technique they used wasn't chemical at all. It was environmental. Roman engineers really grasped something quite profound. Wood simply doesn't rot if there's no oxygen around. So, for bridge foundations like those beneath the Pons Fabricio, they drove these massive oak pilings deep into the riverbed mud. Once these timbers were submerged and buried in oxygen-depleted sediment, they essentially entered a state of suspended animation. Without oxygen, the aerobic bacteria that normally decompose wood just can't function at all. And, remarkably, some of these submerged foundations are still intact even today, almost 21 centuries later. When excavated, the wood is still dense and strong, not petrified, but preserved in a kind of arrested decay, all thanks to simple environmental control. Joinery that defied time, the unsung heroes of Roman construction. If Roman timber treatments were alchemy, then their joinery was art that really approached wizardry. You know, modern construction often relies on metal fasteners, nails, screws, bolts, that create these very rigid connections. But these connections become stress points, where wood expanding and contracting with humidity changes, eventually cracks and fails. The Romans, well, they understood this fundamental problem and solved it with sophisticated joinery that allowed movement while still maintaining strength. The mortise and tenon joint, which was perfected by Roman craftsmen, created mechanical interlocking without the need for metal. A precisely cut projection on one timber, the tenon, slid into a matching cavity, the mortise, in another. But Roman versions, honestly, they incorporated a subtle kind of genius. They cut tenons just slightly oversized and mortises with gentle tapers so that as timbers swelled with moisture, the joint actually tightened. As wood dried and shrank, the joint loosened just enough to prevent internal stresses from building to fracture points. These joints, in a way, breathed with the seasons. In siege engines and bridge construction, Romans employed dovetail joints where the interlocking pieces were shaped like a dove's tail, wider at the end than the base. These joints could only be assembled from one direction, and once together, could withstand enormous tensile forces trying to pull them apart. Perhaps most remarkably, Roman builders designed structures that were self-correcting. Wooden bridges incorporated joints that permitted individual members to shift slightly during floods or earthquakes without the entire structure collapsing. As we stand here in 2026 facing urgent questions about sustainable building materials and the environmental cost of modern construction, these Roman techniques whisper possibilities. The chemical wood preservatives we've relied upon for decades, compounds like copper chromium arsenate, are increasingly recognized as environmental hazards. Yet here were the Romans, achieving superior preservation with lime, volcanic ash, and tree resins. Roman timber engineering embodied a philosophy work with materials' inherent properties rather than against them. You know, it's about accepting that wood will move, will respond to its environment, and designing systems that transform these so-called weaknesses into strengths. Modern engineering, with its emphasis on rigid, unchanging structures, could learn profound lessons from these ancient builders who understood that durability comes not from resisting change, but from accommodating it gracefully. And really, we should consider what we've lost in forgetting these methods. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, and the Byzantine East gradually abandoned Roman building traditions, this accumulated knowledge largely evaporated. Medieval builders, lacking access to Vitruvius's texts and the oral traditions of Roman workshops, had to reinvent timber engineering from scratch, often with inferior results. We're only now, through archaeological investigation and materials science, piecing together what Roman craftsmen once knew instinctively. If we could, reimagine major Roman sites through the lens of their timber components, the empire would look dramatically different. Those stone aqueducts, they were actually supported during construction by massive wooden scaffolding systems that themselves were engineering marvels. The Siege of Masada. That was won by a towering wooden ramp, which honestly required more engineering sophistication than the stone fortifications it overcame. Even the Pantheon's famous concrete dome relied on wooden formwork, so precisely constructed that removing it left the concrete self-supporting, wooden architecture in a way, enabling stone permanence. So the Roman Empire's true durability secret wasn't that they built everything from stone. Actually, it was that they understood wood so intimately that their timber structures rivaled stone's longevity through intelligence rather than just the inherent material properties. They didn't fight against decomposition. Instead, they strategically prevented the conditions that cause it. They didn't force wood into rigid shapes. Rather, they designed joints that let wood be wood, while still serving important structural purposes. This wasn't just primitive trial and error. This was, honestly, applied material science, centuries ahead of its formal invention. As modern society grapples with building sustainably, perhaps we need to stop looking only forward and start looking backward to these Roman engineers who achieved remarkable durability without fossil fuel-intensive treatments, without toxic chemicals, with nothing but observation, patience, and profound respect for their materials. The secrets aren't truly lost. They're waiting in archaeological sites, in ancient texts, in the surviving bridges and foundations that still, against all logic, refuse to rot. We just need the wisdom to recognize that sometimes the most advanced technology is the one we forgot. If this journey into Rome's wooden world has sparked your curiosity, subscribe to Ancient Edge and join us as we continue unearthing the hidden knowledge of the ancient world. Share this video with anyone who believes the past has nothing to teach us about the future. Because sometimes the most revolutionary ideas are the ones our ancestors already knew. Until next time, keep questioning what you think you know about history.